Okay. And I'm going to mute as well. Okay. So I wanted to begin our Passover conversation, and I know it doesn't really go with Jews in the news, but there is a news item that happened with in regards to Passover in Israel that I wanted to talk about. So I just wanted to spend, I don't think we'll take an hour on it today, but I do want to talk about this. So, the laws of Passover, as we know, are the strictest when it comes to kashrut, right? So there's kashrut for year round. And then on top of that, there's kashrut for Passover. So whereas for certain things with kashrut year round, you can fix things, you can make some compromises about. So for example, if your meat fork ends up in the dairy drawer, it's not a big deal. You just move the meat fork from the dairy drawer back to the meat drawer. Just the fact that it was touching an implement that just the fact that a meat implement was touching a dairy implement doesn't make either one of them not kosher. Okay, it's only when heat is applied that there's a question as to whether something has changed its substance from meat to dairy or vice versa. Okay, so or if a drop of milk falls into a big pot of chicken soup, the drop of milk does not nullify the chicken soup and make it treif. Okay, so that's year round. Whereas, as we know for Passover, a drop of chametz, even a microscopic drop of chametz with your Passover food makes your Passover food chametz. Okay, so the 1/60th rule for year round, right? 1/60th of milk related to the volume of the pot of the chicken soup. So therefore, if it's 1/60th or less, it does not invalidate the chicken soup. There is no 1/60th rule for chametz. It's a zero rule. So we know that, and all of the cleaning that has to be done, especially in the kitchen, to rid the home of chametz, all the special food we buy to ensure that processed foods do not have chametz in them, the whole added thing that Ashkenazim say that beans and rice and corn are considered chametz, whereas Sephardic Jews do not see them as chametz. So that adds a whole other layer as well too to this whole, like the Ashkenazi versus Sephardi versus the whole Jewish community vis-a-vis chametz and kosher for Passover. So there is a guide that my rabbinical assembly produces every year to update us on the laws of kashrut and how to, as easily as possible, which it's not easy, but as easily and stress-free as possible, to make our homes kosher or Passover. Okay, so if we've done it before, it becomes easier and easier year after year, and it still is a burden, but isn't as much of a burden as if we're doing it for the first time. Whenever you do something for the first time and you want to do it right, it's very stressful to get it done the right way. But if we've done it before, like, I've kept kosher my whole life, so I don't know any other way. So it's easy for me to be keeping kosher. It's second nature. But if let's say I bought a dog now, I've never been a pet owner in my life. If I bought a dog now, it would be really overwhelming for me to know, what do I have to do in the house? How do I walk the dog? How do I take care of the dog? All these things it's brand new. I wouldn't know the first thing. I'd need some help doing it in order to do it the right way. But after a number of years, I'm sure it becomes second nature. So anything like that, the more you do it, the more it's second nature. So, but this Passover guide, for those who become, there are those who become more and more observant as the years go on. And then there are others, for example, who convert to Judaism, who take upon themselves all of these laws for the very first time. It can be overwhelming. So there's an interesting paragraph here that I want to share with you, which will lead me to a news item that I'm going to share my screen about. Okay, so this guide was prepared by the law committee of the conservative movement, right? So it's, as I've talked about before, my rabbinical association, known as the Rabbinical Assembly, because we are part of the conservative movement, we have a commitment to Jewish law. So we have a committee on Jewish law and standards that continuously discusses issues and matters of Jewish law, so that there's always something new coming up that the committee discusses, finds the appropriate precedents in Jewish legal literature, and then reaches an appropriate conclusion for 2023. So the former chair of the committee is Rabbi Elliot Dorff, and he wrote this introduction about how to go about what Passover means and how we understand kashrut for Passover. And he ends his introduction this way. One last but important comment. Because Passover involves more dietary strictures than the rest of the year, many Jews become downright compulsive about the rules of the holiday. We should be careful not to use these rules to assert our superior piety over others, and remember that observance of Passover should not come at the expense of the values of honoring our parents and treating everyone with respect. Now, I'll go on in a minute, but I just want to highlight this. So there are those who are compulsive about observing matters of Jewish law, right? So that it becomes almost as if it's a contest that who is the better person at observing matters of Jewish law, and who can one up the next person on observing a particular matter to the best way possible. I used to get a long time ago a magazine called Kashrus magazine. I say that on purpose because that's how it was written. So in modern Hebrew, we say the word kashrut. In old-fashioned Hebrew, the letter Tuf, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, sometimes has a dot in it and sometimes it doesn't. So the old-fashioned, shtetl way of pronouncing Hebrew, the Yiddish way of pronouncing Hebrew, makes a difference between that letter Tuf with a dot or without a dot. So there are those who are trained in reading the Tuf without a dot in it as an S. And with a dot, it's a T. Okay, so like Paul Tillis and Joel Friedman in Shul, who read Torah frequently, were both trained in pronouncing the letter Tuf without a dot as an S. So the word kashrut has the letter Tuf at the end of it without a dot. So the magazine is Kashrus magazine, which already tells you which section of the Jewish community this magazine comes from. Their Passover edition, I remember this quite clearly, had a centerfold, and it's not like you would think. You imagine an ultra-Orthodox centerfold for a magazine. The centerfold was had lines on it that you can put your piece of matzah up against the line to see how much matzah you needed to eat to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder. and it had 3 different lines there to show how much of the matzah, according to whose rabbinic opinion you follow, you have to eat. And then it also had in it what the quantity of wine or grape juice you need to drink to fulfill the mitzvah of each cup of wine of the 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Okay, so that's just part of the compulsiveness that Rabbi Dorf is talking about here when it comes to kashrut in general and Passover specifically. And there are those, the more compulsive one is, the less likely one is to make compromises about it, to be able to then, share Passover with your family. Because there are many Jewish families where there are a variety of levels of observance in each family, right? So that, how can a family who keeps kosher for Passover adequately fill the needs of everybody in the family for Passover? So rifts can develop in families for some who insist on a strictly kosher for Passover meal and would then say, we can't come to your house this year because it's not kosher enough. Or if you come to our house, don't bring any of your food. It only has to be our food, right? You can imagine the rifts that could develop within families when it comes to different levels of kashrut. And even though the conservative movement, which follows halacha, would say there shouldn't be different levels of kashrut here, what Rabbi Dorf is suggesting is that we should not be so stubborn about our piety, and rather the piety should not come at the expense, as he says, of valuing the honoring of our parents and treating everyone with respect. So that's an important thing. So then he goes on. Passover is really important, a central feature of what it means to live a Jewish life. Its very meaning, though, is completely undermined if the dietary rules of Passover lead people to treat each other with disrespect. So as we explain the dietary rules of Passover below, we fervently hope that they will instead function as they are supposed to, namely to serve as graphic reminders throughout the holiday of the critical lessons of Passover, of the need to free ourselves and the world around us of all the physical, intellectual, emotional, and communal straits that limit us and others in living a life befitting of people created in the image of God. May we all succeed in making this and every Passover the stimulus for us to fix the world in these ways every day of our lives. Okay, so these laws, it happens with Shabbat, it happens with kashrut year-round, it happens with a variety of things, building a sukkah, those things that have very strict kind of rules on how to do things can be, like the rules can be the be-all and end-all, as opposed to forgetting about the bigger picture, why we are observing it to begin with, right? And Passover is all about family coming together to share the story once again of the miracle of our ancestors being freed from Egyptian bondage. Okay, so this very open, very inclusive approach to understanding the background of why we should be keeping kosher for Passover comes in stark contrast to this that I'm about to share with you. So there's this. This was printed. This is from the Times of Israel, which I've talked about before, how I really enjoy when I want to know news from Israel. I prefer the Times of Israel is my preferred website. Haaretz is left-leaning. Jerusalem Post is right-leaning. And then there's Arutz 7, which is even more right-leaning. So, okay, whatever you like. I like Times of Israel. It seems to be centrist in its approach. So the government of Israel, whatever we think about the current government of Israel, this is an article that appeared 2 weeks ago, ahead of Passover, and March 6th was Erev Purim. So you might think that this could be in the category of what they call Purim Torah, where you take, if you're familiar with a website called The Onion, it's this satire on the news today. It's kind of a comedy. So imagine for Purim, that's what you do. You come up with a funny kind of Devar Torah. You kind of come up with a funny take on the news. This could be considered in the category of Purim Torah, but it's actually not. It's fact. It's what the government proposed. So ahead of Passover, Coalition advances bill that lets hospitals ban chametz. So legislation gives flexibility to hospital administrators to set kosher for Passover rules. In 2020, the High Court order blocked hospital guards from checking visitors' bags for chametz. Now, what we need to understand is that clearly Israel is a Jewish state, okay? That goes without saying, and I think most people in Israel today, no matter their political leanings, will agree that Israel is a Jewish state. Okay, so how that impacts non-Jews who live in Israel and who are citizens of Israel is a whole question, right? From left to right, how to properly treat citizens of Israel who are not Jewish in the Jewish state. There are certain public places in Israel where it is accepted that in public spaces, public kitchens be kosher and be acceptable as kosher. So, for example, most hotels in Israel have to be kosher, so that when you go down for breakfast in the morning for the free breakfast, or eat in the dining room, it's certified kosher. Okay? Whether you keep kosher or not, you know that the hotels in Israel are kosher. That's not so much the case today. There are some boutique hotels that may not be certified kosher, but the big chains, hotel chains, are certified kosher. So the hospital cafeterias are certified kosher. So if you're there at Hadassah Hospital, Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, no matter what hospital in Israel, the cafeteria is going to be kosher. Okay, so public places, everybody can feel comfortable eating in the hotel or in the hospital. Now, the second largest religious denomination in Israel is Muslim. And technically, for Muslims, kosher meat is by definition halal, not vice versa. So in other words, halal meat is not kosher. But kosher is halal. For meat to be considered halal, the animal has to be slaughtered the way we do, right? A knife across the neck. But for Muslims, anybody can do it. For Jews, it has to be somebody certified and trained in how to do it. That's the difference. That's why halal cannot be kosher. But what else needs to happen? So the method of slaughtering is the same for the method of kosher slaughter is acceptable for Muslim slaughter, and God's name has to be invoked as the knife goes across the neck of the animal. So God for Muslims is Allah. Allah and God are the same. Okay, so there's for Muslims, you say something in Arabic like, in God's name I slaughter this animal. The bracha for slaughtering is probably Baruch, the standard formula, Baruch atah Eloheinu melech shekidshanu v'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. So you're invoking God's name there too. So that's why it counts. And even, this is what I learned from a kashrut seminar that I took several years ago, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who slaughter animals in the Midwest in the slaughter facilities say the bracha, and they also say the line in Arabic, which is amazing. Can you picture black hat, black coat Jews slaughtering animals and saying the line in Arabic, invoking Allah's name? It's incredible, and that's what happens. So that's why kosher is considered halal. So for Muslims to eat in a kosher cafeteria in a hotel or in a hospital, it's halal by definition. Okay, so the question is, the coalition wants to ensure that the hospitals in Israel ban chametz, right? So why would they want to ban chametz? Well, clearly they are taking the rule that I was talking about. No amount of chametz could mix or be in the presence of your kosher or Passover food, because if it is, it renders your kosher or Passover food not kosher for Passover, or actually not be able to be eaten at all. Even after, you can't save it for after Passover, because chametz that hasn't been taken care of properly before Passover cannot be used or eaten after Passover. That's why we sell our chametz before the holiday, so that anything that we keep in the freezer or in our pantry can be eaten after the holiday. Because if you don't, then it's in a category of chametz she'avar alav haPassover, haPesach, chametz she'avar alav haPesach. That is chametz that endured Passover, and that chametz that wasn't taken care of is rendered not usable, not edible. Okay, so the ultra-Orthodox are afraid that if Muslims bring their pita into the hospital, and you know, there are no private rooms in hospitals in Israel. You share rooms. So you know, you could, if you're a Jew from the West Bank, could be sharing a room with an Arab from East Jerusalem. And in fact, a doctor from East Jerusalem could be, an Arab doctor from East Jerusalem could be taking care of a Jew from the West Bank. That's the great thing about hospitals in Israel. They are melting pots like that. And so, you know, maybe the doctor or the nurse who is not Jewish could have chametz crumbs on them, and they go to, change the IV bag or something. The crumb could land on the Jewish patient, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox patient. So this is what the article says: a contentious bill enabling public hospital administrators to ban leavened goods or chametz for the upcoming Passover holiday cleared its first reading in the Knesset, 5146. Backed by ultra-Orthodox MKs and decried by a number of Jewish organizations, the bill grants hospital administrators flexibility to determine the special arrangements needed to ensure the patients hospitalized there can keep kosher for Passover. Among other things, this includes, once other alternatives have been considered, establishing protocols banning or limiting the entrance of chametz into the hospital building in full or part during the Passover holiday. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you to say this is how the ultra-Orthodox, who are part of Israel's governing coalition now, want to exert their pressure and coercion on the rest of the Israeli population. Okay, and part of what's happening with the rallies every Saturday night in Israel is rallying against coercion such as this. How dare one particular perspective of Judaism insist that everybody else observe in the same way, right? In other words, this is a matter in which the ultra-Orthodox is creeping into the private lives of all Israelis, okay? So, in other words, let's say I'm a secular Israeli. I don't keep kosher for Passover. I probably have a Seder, but I'm going to have a falafel the next day. Okay, and the falafel let's say you're Sephardic. Okay, so falafel is made from chickpeas. Okay. What kind of oil is it fried in? Okay, so let's say the falafel balls itself could theoretically be kosher for Passover. The pita that you put it in is not kosher for Passover, no matter whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi. So if you bring a falafel into the hospital, can you imagine that in 2020, guards, there's security guards everywhere in Israel. It's just a matter of course. So bags are always checked. Can you imagine security guards having to be trained on what's chametz and to check your bag and say, no, you can't leave. You have to leave your falafel outside. You can't bring it into the hospital. That's crazy. That's crazy. Who would ever think of such a thing? That in a public place like a hospital, you're preventing people from bringing food into the hospital. Okay, now you could say, what do you need food in the hospital for? But we all know, if you're in a hospital, you're in a hospital for a long time and they have to eat. So who's the ultra-Orthodox to tell me what to eat and what not to eat? It's one thing to keep the cafeteria kosher. Okay, I would agree with that. The cafeteria should be strictly kosher. But outside the cafeteria, do what you want. Who's the coercion? The coercion is what I wanted to comment on, which is the opposite of what Rabbi Dorff said in this introduction. It just highlights the difference between ultra-Orthodox and non-ultra-Orthodox Jews. It comes down to how compulsive one is about the observance of law, and seeing any kind of dent in that compulsivity would affect the observance itself. Okay, and so part of being a person is that we make compromises every single day. We might, and anybody who's married knows that you make compromises in order to maintain a healthy relationship. That's just the way it is. Compromise, any relationship that is not built on compromise is most likely doomed to failure. And so that would be, that's what I would say also about an approach to life. Okay, there are certain standards that we have to keep, but there are certain things, even about those standards, that are able to be bent every now and then for shalom bayit, keeping peace in the house, kibud ava'im, for honoring our parents, it's kavod habriot, respect, honor of fellow human beings. We make compromises, and it's inherent in the system. Okay, now clearly, the more fundamentalist one is, the less one is willing to make compromises. But if everybody lives within an ultra-Orthodox system, then it's okay. Live and let live. People in their own bubble, in their own ultra-Orthodox bubble, they can be as compulsive as they want to be, because everybody in the bubble has bought into being in the bubble. But how dare someone in the bubble tell me, who's not in the bubble, how to be Jewish? Who are you in your bubble to tell me that I'm wrong or that I'm right? I don't need you to tell me how to be Jewish. And I don't want you to tell me how to be Jewish. And how dare you to do that? So that's for me, that's a Jewish perspective, that we are not, as part of the conservative movement's ideology, we are not of the compulsive part. We are the more inclusive part. And inclusivity is what it's about. Again, with certain, there are lines within which we live, but those lines are bendable in certain situations, and it's part and parcel of what it means to be a conservative Jew and to be a Jew. Any thoughts or questions about this? So I just wanted to highlight that. That was the first reading, as Times of Israel said. And so anything that comes up to the Knesset has to go through 3 readings. So I haven't heard anything update to this, whether there's even been a second reading yet. But it just goes to the nature of this coalition government now and how really right-wing it is, both in terms of social policy and also in religious policy. Yes, Barbara.
Well, one thing that I think about is that the right wing is getting larger and larger, that they're having lots of children, and which the rest of the country is not. So they are becoming more and more the majority, and so they are setting the rules.
So I'm not so sure about that, but again, we're getting into politics here and social demographics that I'm not an expert on. But I still, from what I understand, the ultra-Orthodox are still only about 20% of the population in Israel. It's a sizable minority, but I don't think it has grown above 20%. The politics of why the ultra-Orthodox party is a part of the coalition is beyond me and beyond my expertise. But so all the rallies are pointing out, one of the things about these rallies is it's not just about the judicial reform, it's about coercion as well. And people who are involved in these protest rallies are realizing that, the ultra-Orthodox should not have as much power over individual lives as they are attempting to have right now. It's one thing, ultra-Orthodox have the sole authority for marriages in Israel. Okay, and that's been the case since for 75 years. And most people are not ultra-Orthodox, but if you want to get married in Israel, you have to go through the chief rabbinate. So there are people over the years who have, traveled to Cyprus because Israeli law recognizes marriage licenses from outside of Israel. So if you get married outside of Israel and you come in with a marriage license, you'd be recognized as married. Okay, so it costs money to go to Cyprus, but Cyprus is the closest place to go where you can get married that way. So there are people who have done that over the years, and they want an end to that coercion like that. And to get divorced in Israel is the same way. You have to go to the rabbinic court to get divorced. So, Bob, you had your question.
I remember I was in Israel for Passover on business probably over 10 years ago.
Yeah,
and I was amazed that in the office building I was in, the vending machines were unplugged during Passover.
Oh,
and I'm thinking, I know everybody I worked with there was very secular.
Right.
Maybe 1 or 2 people.
That's funny.
I was just amazed that it was unplugged. And then I remember going to a restaurant that night or one time, and I sit down and they bring me some bread.
Right.
I said, "No, do you have matzah?"
Right.
And they went out and they got matzah for me. But it's just, there is, I always thought it was a little bit over the top.
So it is funny. The funny thing is there's so many people I know from the congregation who do not keep kosher year round, but will be kosher on Passover. Like people who have never asked me kosher questions before during the year will care about kashrut during Passover. So it's a funny thing. I'm not judging. I'm just saying people for Passover for 1 week, they'll take kashrut seriously in a way that they don't take it during the year. So in an office building to unplug, secular people in Israel, it's so easy. You'd think, those of us from New York, kosher restaurants, you can find them all over the place. So it's easy to keep kosher in New York. Go to any supermarket in New York, there'll be kosher food aplenty to buy, right? Outside of New York, it's a little bit harder. Around here, pretty easy to keep kosher too, okay? But for Passover, it might be a challenge. The Giant here in Olney has a nice Passover section, and we have Shalom's and Moti's, or to go to Baltimore for 7 Mile Market. But still, it takes some doing to do it. But in Israel, it's so easy. It's all the supermarkets in Israel, do their shelves and close off certain sections that are just the chametz, and they have the kosher for Passover and everything. It's so easy to do it. And so even the most secular will for a week be kosher for Passover, to the point where they'll unplug the vending machines, right? So, but it's funny, but you go to a restaurant and, but they found matzah to give you, right? That's not to say that the rest of the food that you were eating was necessarily kosher for Passover. I don't know if they changed the utensils or whatnot, but the food you were eating, the food itself most likely was kosher for Passover. How it was prepared might not have been prepared in a kosher for Passover way. So, you can say that about year-round in restaurants in Israel, unless there are restaurants that will serve shrimp or meat and dairy together. If they don't, and it's still not a certified kosher restaurant, you can almost rest assured that it's kosher, because the meat, it's really hard to find non-kosher meat in Israel. It's really hard. You have to go out of your way to find, especially treif meat, bacon or any other pork products. Really hard to find that in Israel. So it's, the default is almost assuredly kosher. So it's just funny how people for Passover will go that extra mile that they don't do the rest of the year. Jules. Yeah, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I have to make this comment because being raised in New York, my relatives had us over for Pesach every year, and they had all of the family on different nights, and they had the set rules.
Right.
And what I think I want to emphasize is that they were the ones that created not only the Yiddishkeit, the Jewish, but there was a continuation, a hierarchy,
right,
which led you toward an Orthodox viewpoint. I never got unorthodox till I got to Washington when I became conservative.
Right.
I made that choice myself.
Right.
But because I was living in a Orthodox bubble. But it makes me wonder, something that Barbara raised. You talked about politics, and I'm not talking about that.
Right.
But the point she raised was the birth rate among the Orthodox as a fact, not as a political fact,
right,
is far in excess
yes,
of the birth rate for Jews who are not Orthodox.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's true. And now what follows from that is the Orthodox say if you go down the road of non-Orthodoxy, where are you going to end up? And that has been something in my mind. I'm very impressed by the fact that you raised this today.
Yeah,
because
so, no, it is an interesting. Yeah,
I believe it, and I'm not being critical of anything.
Right. So it's interesting. I was at a conference yesterday, sponsored by our federation, in partnership with the Hartman Institute, bringing scholars to talk about with Jewish leaders in the Washington area about the future of the relationship between American Jews and the state of Israel. So I'll talk about that another time, because there's a lot to unpack from the conference yesterday. It was really kind of mind-numbing, all the different kinds of aspects of that question. But one element I was reminded of while you were talking, Jules, is that most 60% of Israelis today, apparently, according to this one survey, thinks that the American Jewish community will disappear in 20 years because of assimilation. So, in other words, the nature of the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel, from the perspective of Israel, right? So, what should Israel have a relationship with American Jews? Most Israelis think, no, why bother? Unless you live in Israel, you're not worth talking to, and you're going to be gone in 20 years anyway. All right, so there's so the question is how of continuity. So sociologists have been threatening for decades that the American Jewish community is on its last legs. So I don't know how do we maintain the vitality of the community? Is it through observance? Is it through what other kinds of connections do we have to ensure a strong identity? And how do we define Jewish identity today? Do we find Jewish identity by what we eat, by family, our DNA, by who we associate with, by how we observe? A whole variety of ways of understanding how we identify as a Jew today. One way to ensure continuity is through numbers. The more babies we have, the more likely we are that Judaism, the Jewish community, will continue into the next generation. So, for the ultra-Orthodox to have 10 kids is nothing, but, part of living in America, part of living in a liberal Western democracy is people just don't have 10 kids. It's just not a thing, right? Ultra-Orthodox Catholics might still have 10 kids, but even among Catholics, they have less kids than they used to. So,
Except Muncie.
Well, I'm just saying, an ultra-Orthodox community, right?
In the United States.
Yeah. So ultra-Orthodox, no matter where they are, they're ultra-Orthodox. And they are in their bubble to maintain their ultra-Orthodox lifestyle. So it doesn't matter where they live, they're going to make it happen so that they're ultra-Orthodox. So, so the ultra-Orthodox community is expanding because of their numbers. So they keep finding places to move to transform into an ultra-Orthodox community, but still, the numbers are still around in Israel. 20% of the Israeli population is ultra-Orthodox. So, just interesting ideas here. But the main thing I wanted to talk about is observance and coercion, and how it's a different kind of perspective one takes to Jewish law, whether one is coercive or not. All right, folks, have a good rest of the day, and perhaps next Monday, I'll be in a position to be able to talk about the American Jewish community relationship with Israel and what I learned from the conference yesterday.
Rabbi,
Yes,
before
Jules?
you go, you asked the question, how do we create interest in the Jewish community?
Uh-huh.
One of the things that you're doing is creating the interest. The trouble is that you don't get enough people who are watching it
That's a whole other question.
Yes, it's still, I have to compliment you on the fact that, and I appreciate it, that you do it, because I sit and listen, I get a value out of it, and it's an unbiased,
I appreciate that, Jules. Yes.
And I want you to know that that's one way we ought to encourage people to come and listen to these things.
I appreciate that, but if you those people who listen to podcasts, these sessions like this are a dime a dozen. So there's so many rabbis out there who are who are creating podcasts about different aspects of Jewish life. So there's so much to choose from out there. So, the fact that it looks like 25 people are viewing the recording every week, I'm happy with that. Are they all members of the shul? I don't know. Maybe there are other people who come to it and find it. Whatever it is, doing my little part to just raise awareness and to think about Jewish things.
It's not a little part, it's a big part.
I thank you, Jules. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
You too.